All right, we're ready to roll here. We are going to get right back into Romans today as we were last week. I'd mentioned being in 3 different chapters over a 2-week period. So this is week 2. We'll be in Romans again today as we were looking last week at the idea of loving our neighbor in specific ways out of out of chapter 12, Romans chapter 12. Because when we talk about loving our neighbor, we're talking about loving them, number one, in action rather than in how we feel, because that can't be fabricated. Number 2, that Scripture calls for love regardless of how we feel. And so number 3, if we're going to do that consistently, just like this morning in the lesson we were talking about reliance upon God is a series of continuous choices. Reliance has to be maintained. The fact that I chose reliance on Tuesday does not mean on Friday when it's hard I'm going to rely. I've got to choose reliance on Friday. And so loving is the same way. Because I loved back here, it doesn't build me up. You know, some of us carry around maybe a credit card in our wallet that has the opportunity to build up flight miles. Or we carry around a credit card in our wallet that has some sort of point system that you can redeem for points for flights or hotel stays and other things. Or you've got one where it gives you X percent back on purchases, 1% back on this purchase or that purchase. And so we kind of live that way. We can, if we're not careful, we can begin to fool ourselves. I don't think it's the case where if I ask somebody specifically or if they ask me, I would say, oh yes, I believe it works that way. No, but unintentionally, it's as if we think, well, you know, I've built up some stuff down here. Therefore, when it comes up down here, I can say, yeah, I think we've got enough points for that back here. Well, that's not the way it works, right? We don't have, as God's people, we have no laurels on which we can rest. You know, somebody talks about resting on their laurels. What are they talking about? They're talking about resting on that which has been on their resume. See? I've gotten this. I'm resting on this. You put a resume in somebody and you're in front of somebody and you're saying, Mr. Smith, I believe I can do the job that you're needing done, and here's where that confidence rests. The confidence in my statement that yes, I can do the job, it rests in what I've done back here. And that's why you can have confidence that I can do it again, do it now, because I've done it before. God's got a resume, God's got laurels, and they're really, really strong. And we talked about that this morning. Look at God's history with His people. But I don't have that. And therefore I can't reach back and go, this person needs love. I'll pull it forward from that time way back here. I think I had a little left over, and I'll apply it right here. No, there's going to be a choice in that situation on that day, in the level of that difficulty, or in the face, rather, of that difficulty, which might be tremendously different than the level of difficulty to love that person back there. And so we have to stay specific, and we have to stay consistent in this picture of loving other people and loving our neighbor. I had a coworker one time whose wife, he used to tell me this, but I had never seen it in action. And then the day came where I saw it in action, where she was present, he was present, I was present, and he was being whatever, I don't know what adjective she would use to describe how he was being in that moment. But she looked at me and I don't know why she gave me that look, but I learned later, and I was like, you should have given it to him. But she looked at me rather, like that, like I'm about to get him. And she turned and she looked at him and she said, I'm trying, she said with gritted teeth, I'm trying to love you. And so the degree of difficulty is not always the same. Sometimes it's with gritted teeth. So regardless of who it was, what it was, when it was, and why it was way down there, when I've got the opportunity here, it doesn't matter what I've done. If I pass by on the other side, as we started the quarter off looking at that familiar parable, if I pass by on the other side, this down here, this action, this activity, this even sacrificial activity, sacrificial love, that doesn't pull forward and apply to right here. It's daily. I got to do it again and again and again. So that's why it's specific, because every day it's going to be different. So we're in Romans again, as we were last week, and we were looking at some specific verses, especially starting in verse 9 and running through the remainder of the chapter last week. We're going to be in chapter 13 here to begin, and then we'll continue into chapter 14. And I want to suggest that loving our neighbor extends to what happens in the first verses of chapter 13. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister. Now who's he? The governing authority. Who's he? The governing authority that God has allowed. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he, that is authority, he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. I want to pause right there temporarily. Oftentimes when we preach from the opening of Romans chapter 13, maybe teach classes from it, if we are taking the time to really just hone in on this verse by verse by verse and not use it as an illustration more so today, then the focus might extend to Scripture's view on capital punishment. And I understand why that's taken into account right here. And I think it's accurate to take into account right here. But that's not my focus today. My focus today starts in Romans 13 and extends to other passages of Scripture which clearly teach in various ways this principle. Christians are good citizens. If I'm going to love my neighbor, part of loving neighbor is being a good citizen. That's part of loving neighbor. Part of loving neighbor, as we extend this thought into other passages of Scripture where Paul, same author obviously, will say to various congregations, you ought to be the one somebody wants to hire. You ought to be the one somebody wants to live next door to. You ought to be the one somebody wants teaching your children, their children. Scripture says things to the Christian like, as I summarize this idea from a greater section of Scripture, that we ought to be the best employees. That our word is did Jesus say, let your what? Let your what be what? And your what be what? Yea? That's not like cheering for your team. No. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And that's good enough because you're my disciple. And they learn that that's good enough because you're my disciple. That's who we're supposed to be. Better yet, what we're supposed to or how we're supposed to be known. Part of loving our neighbor is doing those things which are not sought only for my good, but for the good of a greater group. Row of homes, greater community, full city, nation. Stewardship is not just about how I spend my money. Stewardship's about how I spend my time. Stewardship's about how I use my gifts. We looked at that last week. Stewardship is about how I use myself upon and for other people. Loving neighbor extends to this right here. Loving neighbor extends to citizenship. This is Paul writing to the church at Rome. And he's saying, this is how you ought to be seen. This is how you ought to be known. This is how you act. And he gives the why. We looked through the first 5 verses. Now he's going to extend into paying taxes, verse 6. Notice he says, attending continually to this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. This is how I'm supposed to be known, not just to God. God sees, God hears. This is how I'm known to Him if this is me, if this is my regular behavior, if these are my regular choices, if this is my regular example. God knows. Well, of course God knows. God is omniscient. God is omnipresent. But that's not the thrust. That's not the emphasis here. This is how I'm to be known, not just of God, by God. This is how I'm to be known here. There was a popular, very popular TV show, NBC, that I don't know if it's done or if it just, it always seems like they're having their final episode and then 8 seasons later you're still in it. But anyway, but they may have had a final season. And some of you will recognize it immediately. A show on NBC, I don't remember what night, it was called This Is Us. This is us. This is us. Kind of that show designed, at least it seemed, to be, now look, this is us. We're a group of this and a group of that, and we have our own problems, and we come together, and sometimes we, like all families do, this is us, and take us or leave us, this is us, but in the end it's beautiful. This is to be us among neighbors. And the us, this is us, yeah, we do the same thing that they do. We do the same thing in terms of finding elation in some things that civil government may be or do, choose. This party, that party, federally, locally, anything in between. And we go like this depending on who is doing what in governance. And our emotions go like this, and then the people over here, well, their emotions do the same thing. It's just if we're here, they're here because they think differently than we do. And then it's... But this is to be us. Despite those feelings and those opinions, this is to be us. And so, one way in which I love my neighbor, and see, if I can go back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, who is my neighbor? That was the question, right, that kicked that whole thing off. Who is my neighbor? And the neighbor was with whomever I'm passing by. The neighbor is with whom I have opportunity. It's not, is it this person, or is it that person, or is it that person, or is it that person? It's, yes, this is us. subject to government, civility, in the face of whatever. You know, I tell you who we can count on. By the way, this congregation has been a long time supporter of what we call disaster relief, right? You know that work. We make announcements from time to time about disaster relief, packing boxes on Monday at 10 a.m., and we ask for people that can to go over there and help them do that. You know, over the years, I've heard some tremendous things for some tremendous people that live far away from here about what the community thought when disaster relief showed up. And you know, some areas of the country seem to, I don't know if this is true, but it sure seems like it's true. Again, they've got that, didn't they just have a bad, oh me. You know, they're getting hammered all the time, it seems. You know, some areas, some particular, we get that in coastal areas. But I mean not necessarily just in coastal areas. There was a time where it seemed like the Midwest, like through Oklahoma. I remember a time growing up where it seemed like in Oklahoma that, you know, their schedule was Monday, Wednesday, Friday for a tornado. You know. And so the recurrence. But do you know what I've heard from multiple people over an extended period of time in terms of years? We always know that those church folks are going to show up with Churches of Christ disaster relief effort. We always know they're going to show up. We know what we're going to get. That provides opportunity, launching point for other conversations that are a whole lot more important than, did you have insurance on your home? Can we help you with canned goods? Conversations that need to be had that could not be, and I could tell you about specific people in specific cities and states over the years whose first conversation about Jesus was with somebody who came to relieve after devastation. And their first words were not, we're so sorry, we're praying for you, here's a can of baked beans, and do you want to have a Bible study? Now, I'm not saying that love doesn't get there, because quite frankly, if it doesn't get there, I'm not sure it's the love of the New Testament, as I have opportunity. At some point in time, we say something. We exhibit something, yes, but Scripture didn't say go into all the world and exemplify the gospel to every creature. It does in other ways and other passages. We are to do that, but the verse I'm talking about, which you know well, go into all the world and, what is it? Preach the gospel, teach. That's what that verse says. And I can't meet Scripture and remain silent all the time. But they need to know this is us. Loving our neighbor. Look at verse 8. Head through verse 10. By the way, I don't know, how many of you are holding a Bible that are have headings above sections. Most do, and different publishers and translations will maybe make that division on how to head something. In my Bible here, above verse 8 and running through verse 10, the heading here is, how about that? Love your neighbor. And it begins this way: owe no man anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. Now stop right there. Owe no man anything. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I bet most hands would go up. Do you have a mortgage on your home? Or I could say, we could do it the other way. I could ask a question, frame it in a way that I assume not a whole lot of hands would go up. Maybe you'd be surprised. Maybe I'd be shocked to find out, but I don't think a lot of hands would go up. I could say, raise your hand if you paid cash for your house, all cash for your house. Especially if I said your first house when you were 24. This passage is not meant to teach, and this passage does not teach that the Christian can't owe money. That's not the passage, that's not the meaning. In the Greek language, you've got an understanding here in the original language of a tense that means don't keep on. Remember a minute ago I was saying this is us? This is how we're known. This is how we're to be known. These are some of the areas, some of the ways, some of the descriptions in which we should be known to the greater community. This is in step with that idea, even from the original language. It's not, you can't have a mortgage or a car payment or whatever. It says that who we are, we're not the people that are known as the debtors all the time. We're not the debtors all the time. We don't just live in this. The only thing we remain is the idea that we owe, we're in constant owing of love because of the love that has constantly been showered upon us by God. Back to, I mentioned a TV show a few minutes ago, This Is Us, and go back to a movie rather than a TV show. Any of you see the movie? It's been several years ago, and it kind of became a national thing, and people began to actually put together little various efforts in various communities and nationally and even globally on this idea, pay it forward. Do you remember that movie? It started with a movie, Pay It Forward. That's the concept here. Pay it forward. You've been given something. Now I want you to pay it forward. There's a great man that attends the Hillsborough congregation in Nashville. We will probably have him over here very soon for a men's breakfast. He was an elder there for many years, several years, including when Dad was preaching there. And he was chairman of the board at Lipscomb University years ago for a while. And he and his son, well, in fact, he's related to, what am I thinking? There's Robert Hutchinson sitting back there. And so he's married to Ann. And years ago, they have a daughter and a son, and years ago he took his son, Pat, and they couldn't make it in one swoop and be gone for 6 months, but they'd go for a week or two maybe somewhere, and they'd come back a while and study it, and then they'd choose their next place and go. And in fact, he wrote a marvelous book. You should look it up. You can buy it. It's a great coffee table book. It's a great conversation starter. I've got one at my house. My mom's got one. We had him come to a men's breakfast at Center Chapel when I preached there, and the book was called Looking for Goodwill. And what they did is they came up with just a few questions, and they wanted to read America. He said, here's what we're going to do. And they might sit, for example, they might here's a small town in somewhere in Missouri. Maybe here's a somewhat larger town down in Florida somewhere, or here's whatever. And they went all over the country, literally, all over the country. And they would sort of think, who looks to be a good interview? And I had these questions for these people. And they were pretty simple. And they wanted to ask, would you participate? We're working on this study, and it would become a book. So would you participate? And they would give, I don't remember, it may have been, back then, it may have been $10, it may have been $20, but I think it was $10. And they would give each one of them a $10 bill just for their time. And it didn't take very long. It was only, 3 or 4 questions. And their only ask, all we ask, is that you take this money. We're not really paying you for your time. we'd like to ask you to pay this forward, do something with it for somebody else, and then here's our contact. Send us your picture, send us your further contact information. Tell us what you did with this money and for whom. And the title of the book, Looking for Goodwill. And it was a fascinating opportunity they had, fascinating study of America and their mindsets toward these 3 or 4 questions asked, and to get back from all those people what they did with that little bit of money, to pay it forward. And they have the pictures of these people in the book and the summaries of their interviews, and you learn about real people all over the map in small towns. And it's really, you hear about things being disheartening, it's very heartening of what's still out there in our nation, even though what we see on the news is so disturbing. But what and who is still out there? This is what they were asking people to put into action. Feel like because you've been given something, you want to give that to something else. When you look at verse 8, when he says, owe no one anything, the idea from the original language is don't keep on owing. That's not who you are. You're known as such. You're the one always in a position of this side of the equation, never in the... Here's what I want you to do. I want you to see a continual debt of something else, rather than just continuing debt. Owe no one anything except. Now, I circled the word except right before we started class. I circled the word except. Why? Please, I think you will understand how I mean this next word. Remember, this is us. Because we are supposed to be exceptional as a people. Except we are supposed to be exceptional. That's to be God's people. We're supposed to be the exception, not the rule. We're supposed to be exceptional. That doesn't mean perfection. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter what records you're looking at. Whoever holds the record for the most this or the fewest that or the best this or the best that is always going to be a member of the Lord's church. It doesn't matter if it's a 800 relay run in track or something done in golf or somebody that holds something you'd find in Guinness Book of World Records. That's not what we're talking about. We are to be the exception. The rule is what begins verse 8. But after just a few words, he puts in a striking impact word, comparative. By comparison, he puts in except. You, my people, be the exception. This is very common. Owe no one anything. Somebody, 100 people something. You be the exception in how you view you, your time, your money, you're this, you're this, you're this. You be the exception. Stand out. That's why I circled the word except. Except to love one another. For he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. And if there's any other commandment, they're all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, I want to submit to you that the Bible as a whole, the New Testament as a whole, and other passages, drawing other passages into this idea, don't get the wrong idea when he says in verse 10, love does no harm to a neighbor, that it ends there. You know, I think last week I used the Hippocratic Oath as an example. First, do no harm. That's the oath that the doctor takes. First, do no harm. You don't have a patient on a table, a patient about to enter surgery, and you go, oh, I don't know, we might try a little this, and if that doesn't work, we'll try this. And, that's not, no thanks. I want someone that understands what's to be done and what's to be avoided. First, you approach this is precious, this life, this body, this person. And because that's true, I look to first not make matters worse, first do no harm. But don't misunderstand verse 10. When it says love does no harm to a neighbor, that doesn't necessarily mean that as long as I didn't do harm, I loved them. That's not necessarily so. I mean, in the Lord's parable, the Good Samaritan, let's go right back to it again. In the Lord's parable, did somebody go over and beat on him and make it worse? Was the basis of the one used and held up as the example the fact that he just did not do harm? Or do we see Jesus saying he sacrificed? He put him on his own beast. He carried him. He took time. He paid for what had to be paid for out of his own pocket. And he said, hey, do what you got to do. And if this isn't enough, I'll pay you more when I get back. Sacrificial. I don't want us to look at verse 10 and think, as long as I don't do harm, I loved them. What if there was a need for something specific? And I had that within me. Time, opportunity, resources, whatever it was. What if there was, well, I didn't do any harm, therefore I loved them. No. So don't get verse 10 mixed up when he says love does no harm to a neighbor. That's true, but it also seeks to not just not do harm, it seeks to do good. Love is the fulfillment of the law. So in verse 11 through 14, he talks about putting on Christ. And I'd like for you to go to chapter 14 now. Because as we love our neighbor, we have to keep in mind what opens chapter 14. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. Again, back to the headings above chapters in the Bible. You may have a heading that says something like this, as I do, the law of liberty. So what we're looking at in chapter 14, Paul's talking about the law of liberty. This is not the only place where this is dealt with, and by the same apostle, by Paul. He deals with this in Corinthians as well. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things. I circled another word in verse 1 that I think matters, just like I mentioned the word accept, to be exceptional. We are the exception, not the rule. I mean, let's face it, you and I are living in a time where the rule, it seems more and more, I just talked about watching the evening news, more and more, unfortunately, it seems the more news I watch, the rule is getting uglier and uglier. But we're to be the exception. Well, just like I circled that word, I circled the first word of chapter 14, receive. Remember a minute ago when I said, don't misunderstand the close of the previous chapter, or toward the close of the previous chapter, in verse 10, back up to verse 10. Love does no harm to a neighbor, and I said, let's not make the mistake of thinking as long as we've not done harm, we've done good. That God calls us to something greater than just not doing harm, and calls us to impact. Well, along that similar line, I want to use and circle in our minds, I want you to circle or underscore in your mind the word receive. Now, you may have a different word that opens verse 1, opens the chapter 14. But I circled the word receive. Because again, the reception of something is proactive. I've said this before from this exact aisle in a class. I don't ever want this congregation, and I don't want any congregation of God's people to gain a reputation. Now, don't misunderstand me. It's a two-way street, okay? I remember as an early teenager, probably about age 14. I don't know why I remember this, but it applies to this. I can remember one time my dad making a statement in the pulpit that said, if you leave, now sometimes people have to do this, okay? Sometimes people have to do this. But stay with me for the rest of the statement. If you always run out the door during the during the closing song. So that by the time we're leading the closing prayer, you're already in the car and moving. And that's your regular habit. You may need to do that. I don't know if you do or don't, or why you do or don't, and that's fine. But if that's your regular habit, and then he mentioned some other habits, they said, don't you dare ever call this an unfriendly congregation. Two sides of the coin. I understand that. But receive. I circled the word receive. Why do you think I circled the word receive? It's because all quarter, every week, without fail, at the start of class, and I do it, I know I do it. I do it on purpose. In this study, we have to talk about, constantly remind the specific nature of the love we're talking about. Agape love, agapao love, that doesn't have to do with how we feel, that it's a love in action, and that action is consistent. And to receive somebody, receive one another, is not, back to the same old thing, it's not just not doing harm. Receive, well, he's different than I am, she's different from I am. She has a different mindset toward this element, this passage, this, well, that, if I was to tell you the whole story about how that went in school between my daughter and their daughter, well, we used to work together and we weren't always in agreement at work. Well, fill in the blank. Here's what the Word says. Receive. Reception takes something in. They don't call it a reception. There's NFL playoff games today, as there were last night on TV, and I can promise you what you're not going to see. Let's say Eric Jenkins was an NFL star wide receiver. Let's say that, Eric. And he was playing this afternoon. And if he drops the only ball thrown to him, tomorrow morning in the box score, and it says receiving, and it's got Smith, 3 receptions for 90 yards. Jones, 2 receptions for 54 yards. It's not going to say Jenkins, 1. You don't get credit for a reception if you dropped it. It's got to be brought in. We all get that point. To receive something, it has to be brought in. Did Eric do harm to the ball? No. Did he pull out a pocket knife out of his back of his uniform and stab the football and deflate it? Did he do any of that? No. But he didn't receive it. So you're not going to see that in the paper. Verse 1 says, receive one who is weak in the faith. And the point is do not determine, well, I'm going to put forth these parameters, and if you meet them, I will receive you. Somebody a long time ago, and we'll close with this idea, and then we'll look at chapter 14 next week. Somebody a long time ago was the first person to say this phrase, use this phrase. I don't have a clue. If you know who it was, tell me after class. Somebody a long time ago, way back when, was the first person to say, just who do you think you are? Just who in the world do I think I am if one who is weak in the faith could not be received until he meets my standard? Love your neighbor. We'll pick up in chapter 14 next week. Thank you for being here.